Good evening. Welcome to the Jewish Theological Seminary. If you've got one of these, as I'm quite sure you do, please put it on silent or whatever its equivalent is, although they may ask you to pull up your Judaical library on it. We'll see about that. My name is David Kramer. I am director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And if you'll take just half a second to look around, and particularly to look in this direction, even though this is today called the Women's League Seminary Synagogue, this was actually, at its construction and for many years, the reading room of the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And if you were to go up these stairs and further in there, you would have been entering the rare book room of the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary with its absolutely astounding collection, a collection we regret to say is in storage until the library is finished and we bring it back out for people to use. I mention all of this because tonight's program is part of a 3-day sequence program, very, very rich. Having participated in the first day of it, I can really attest to its richness, called Reading Hebrew Handwriting in the Margins, Early Modern Hebrew Paleography. So this is 3 days for people who love Hebrew books and writing that is devoted to the question of Hebrew books, and tonight, From Scroll to Screen, Revolutions in Jewish Book History. I just want to comment before introducing my friend and colleague, Marjorie Lehman, that tonight's presentation is sponsored in part by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in particular by the Rabbis Ben Zion and Baruch Boxer Memorial Fund, a fund that has been supporting some really fabulous programming, lectures, and the like over the course of years since Baruch's loss. And I just want to say a word about that before introducing Marjorie. I only knew Ben Zion, Baruch's father, from his writings, but he was devoted to Jewish books and particularly to the persons who populated rabbinic literature and had much of value to contribute to the study of that field. His son, following in his father's footsteps to some degree, and then going in a more scholarly as a pulpit direction, found his life in the university with very important scholarship. The last part of his career was here at JTS, and any of us who were around at the time will recall with joy and humility, and I think both of those terms are appropriate. Joy, the simple fact that Baruch was a friend and colleague of ours, from whom we always had something to learn. And I've got to say, to this day, in my teaching, both in classrooms here and in synagogues, when I'm invited to speak at various places across the country, I often have opportunity to share with my students what I learned from Baruch Boxer, which was quite considerable and for which I am very grateful. And the humility comes in the fact that Baruch was just a voracious and brilliant scholar who was devoted to Jewish books and particularly to rabbinic literature in every possible sense of the term and from every conceivable angle, because his voraciousness assured that he would ask all the questions that the rest of us ought to have been asking but didn't always know how to. So that's the highest praise I can share about Baruch, and we're grateful for his teachings and his memory, and thank you. I'm sure he would have been thrilled to know that the fund that was founded in his memory would help to support a program like this. So that is my introduction. I am quite sure you're in for a wonderful treat, learning a lot, and as I said, I just want to introduce my friend and colleague Marjorie Lehman. She is Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics here at JTS. She specializes in the field just mentioned with a specific focus on gender. Her first book, an absolutely wonderful book, from which, if you haven't read it, you will learn a great deal about the Sephardic exile diaspora and its efforts to overcome the challenge of that catastrophe. Her first book was called The Ein Yaakov, Yaakov Ibn Habib's Search for Faith in the Talmudic Corpus, was published in 2012. She's co-edited 2 books, Learning to Read Talmud, What It Looks Like and How It Happens, 2017, and Mothers in Jewish Cultural Imagination, 2017. All were finalists for the National Jewish Book Award. My friend, Marjorie Lehman.
So thank you, David, and of course, JTS, for helping to sponsor this evening. Also, many thanks, and I just reiterate David's comments to Ann Wimpeimer and the Boxer family for supporting us. It means a lot to me to speak about the Jewish book in the context of remembering my teacher, Baruch Boxer. There probably is no Jewish book that has been reprinted more times or used more than the Passover Haggadah, and I credit Professor Boxer with adding a significant scholarly voice to the history of the origins of the Haggadah, research that has informed my practice, my teaching, and even my research with respect to this holiday. I would also like to thank, there were so many people who enabled this event. I just want to acknowledge from JTS, Tom Kasdan, Elisa Braun, Chava Blumenthal, Andrea Glick, Josie Gray, Hope Johnson, Mark Hudson, our new media staff and our maintenance staff, and our esteemed provost, Shuli Schwartz. I also want to acknowledge that this is a very important moment for the 4 of us sitting here. It is 10 years since we began meeting as a scholars working group at the Center for Jewish History. Some of you who are in this room were part of those meetings and part of this ongoing research group on the history of the Jewish book. We could not have predicted at that time where our conversations would lead us, but indeed we were able to recognize a gap in research on the history of the Jewish book, which had until that point not yet been a focus, which is the individual book copy and the history of the movement of copies of Jewish books. This led to the birth of a project called Footprints, which the 4 of us co-direct, and which to date has partners working with us in every place where there are Jewish books in the world. When you think about your own collections of books, and I'm just giving you a little bit of an introduction to what Footprints is before we move on to our larger conversation, I am sure that many of your books have personal stories. Where did the book come from? How did you get it? Was it a gift? From whom? In honor of what? Whose signatures can be found within it? Who owned it before you did? Who took notes in the margins, and what types of notes are they? What does the fact that you have that book say about you? What does it say about what your interests are? And what does it say about your connection to your past? And what future life do you want it to have? Footprints pays attention to every book copy we can get our hands on and records, every Jewish book copy we can get our hands on, and records its individual story from the moment of print until the present day. The purpose of our project is to capture the long history of the movement of Jewish books since the inception of print, with funds from JTS and the expertise of technologists, some of whom are here, including Susan Dreyer, Zarina Mustafa, and Kenny Hirschman, who are part of the Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning. We were able to set up a database that aggregates all of the information available to us regarding the history of the Jewish book copies, tracing what we call their footprints. It's an open source format that invites anyone to add information from their own collections or libraries, drawing in participants committed to the same desire to preserve Jewish book history. Indeed, we have been able to make the present day technological revolution work for us, linking our fields of Jewish studies with library science and computer science, loosening the boundaries that once divided us, we have been able to ride this wave of interdisciplinarity in a way that benefits the history of Jewish books and Jewish studies. The event this evening coincides, as David said, with a 3-day workshop taking place here at JTS and at Columbia focused on paleography, which is the reading of early modern handwritten material for us found in printed books. This skill is essential for determining and then recording the individual footprints of copies of Jewish books. We would like to thank and acknowledge Professor Edward Fram, a historian from Hebrew University, for serving as our workshop training leader, and the participants in this workshop who've joined us this evening as well. And now to the topic for today and to our panelists. Footprints is a modern-day example of the way Jews become active participants in the worlds they inhabit, adapting to and drawing from cutting-edge innovations. Looking back a few centuries to the advent of the printing press, we can also make similar claims about the Jews' use of this new technology to transform Jewish life and culture. Invented around 1450, Jews embraced this technology such that by 1469, books in Hebrew print began to appear before parts of Europe even had printing presses. The earliest books were printed in either Roman, Greek, or Hebrew characters. And now in 2020, as the internet and the smartphone offer new challenges to the way we communicate and read, we are convening this panel to explore continuities and changes across the long stretch of Jewish book history. Just like the internet and the smartphone have been transformative inventions, the printing press was revolutionary in its day. Each has had a great effect on Jews' life and learning, and yet then, as now, we have concerns about what we stand to lose in the wake of these transformations. For example, once I could stand in a room just like this and teach a room full of people, many of whom felt quite intimidated by the study of Talmud. It was for the experts, they would tell me, familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic. But now everyone's an expert. With the start of the new Daf Yomi cycle, which is people participating in reading a page of the Babylonian Talmud every day for a cycle of 7 years, everyone around me is studying the Daf. Typing in a link to the website Sefaria.com brings up the entire Babylonian Talmud in translation. Even a dictionary is hyperlinked. In the many conversations I've had with friends about their participation, I've had some very interesting responses. They love to come over to me, Marjorie, I'm doing the Daf. And I'll say to them, well, how do you have time? And they say, well, when I walk the dog, I take my phone out and I read the Daf. Another close friend told me now he feels truly an authentic Jew because now he is going through every page of the Babylonian Talmud. And so I ask you to think about what have we gained and what have we lost in the wake of this next change in the history of the Jewish book. Now I would like to introduce you to my colleagues who have become my close friends and have modeled how incredible collaborative work in academia can be. I'm going to read short bios, post questions, and I'm going to engage them to speak about the history of the book from the perspective of their fields and interests. We're going to pass around some index cards. I'm hoping they're going around or that you received them so that we can continue this discussion with you. Please jot down comments and questions on the cards, and we will address them in the latter part of this conversation. So just pass them. There'll be two people, Susan and Rachel, who'll be coming around. They'll collect your index cards, and so we want to engage you and pull you into the discussion. Any questions we don't get to, we promise we can answer them. We'll remain a little bit afterward. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Michelle Chesner, who is the Norman E. Alexander Librarian for Jewish Studies at Columbia University. She is the president of the Research, Archives, and Special Libraries Division and the co-coordinator of the Northeast Judaica Bibliographers Group. Her research interests lie in early Hebrew printing and the history of Judaica collections. A native of Baltimore, Michelle's degrees are from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Maryland, Baltimore County, Long Island University, and New York University. Adam Shear is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. His reception history of Judah Halevi's 12th century defense of Judaism, the Kuzari, and the shaping of Jewish identity, 1167 to 1900, received the National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship and the Morris D. Forkash Prize for the best book in intellectual history from the Journal of the History of Ideas. He is currently completing a 4-year term as co-editor of the Association for Jewish Studies Review, the flagship journal of the Association for Jewish Studies. A native of Washington, D.C., he was educated at Yale University, University of Pennsylvania, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
We're the Orioles fans over here.
Joshua Teplitsky is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the program in Judaic Studies at Stony Brook University. He's a native of Toronto. He earned his PhD from New York University's Departments of History, Hebrew, and Judaic Studies, and has held fellowships at Oxford University, the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, the National Library of Israel, and Harvard University. His first book, Prince of the Press, How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library, was published by Yale University Press in 2019 and was named a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. So, without further ado, I'm going to start off with a set of questions, and we are going to, I'm going to open up the discussion to them. We'll do a bit of discussing among ourselves first, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So I ask you, if you could tell us a little bit what draws you to the field of the history of Jewish books, why it matters to you so much, what is significant about it, what your intellectual interests are, just tell us a little bit about what you do.
Okay, so I'll start. I'm Michelle. Hi. So I am the librarian on the team. So books are my world and my life. What I do at Columbia, I came into a brand new position in 2010. There had never been a dedicated position for a librarian for Jewish studies, and what I discovered was that our collection is actually the 3rd largest in the country of Hebrew manuscripts. The first, of course, we're sitting in their building. So I work collecting both rare materials and general materials. So that means I'm literally collecting from scroll to screen, to invoke our title. And there are definitely days on which I bring out both scrolls and screens in teaching about Jewish studies and how to do research in Jewish studies. So I've thought a lot about sort of the past and the future of the Jewish book as in my position as the president of the research division of the Association of Jewish Libraries. This is actually something that I have to think about quite a bit aside from my regular job. So when I started looking for a graduate program in library science, I spoke to the librarians that I knew, and I said, well, where did you get your degrees? And I was told by a few people, Columbia. And so I went online, because there wasn't online at the time, and I looked for Columbia's library school, which did not exist anymore. Because what had happened was in the 90s, there was the death of libraries was predicted. Now that everything was digital, there was no longer a need for libraries because you could find everything online. Well, that was not the case. I'm sad to say that Columbia closed their library school, but I did find a different one. And that's something that we think about all the time. And as a librarian, this is a question that I am asked fairly often. Oh, what do you mean? So what do you do? Because everything's online. And there are lots of answers to that question. One of them is what we find in footprints. So there is, what I like to say is that there is no such thing as a duplicate copy of an early printed book. And for a class that I did, that I co-taught with Professor Elisheva Karbach last year, a while back, one of the things that we did was we brought out 2 volumes of the same imprint. So the same book that was printed at the same press on the same date. And some were bigger and some were smaller and some were bound in modern bindings and some had annotations and some didn't. And what we were trying to show was that every single book is actually quite unique and tells a unique story. One of the reasons that I actually became a librarian was in my, I guess, discovery of the story of the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Project and the fact that the Nazis had looted many, many books And this was while I was still in undergrad. And then the U.S. Army found these stashes of books, brought them to this warehouse, and then sort of spread them out throughout the world. They returned whatever they could, and whatever they could not find owners for, they sent to libraries around the world, in America, in England, in other places as well. And I was a history major at the time, and I realized that books are the closest that we can get to the people of the past. If you look at a 16th century imprint, and you have an inscription there, we just found this for footprints, Miriam bat Avraham, in a book of Midrash. What does that tell us? Who's Miriam? Is she studying this book? Does she own this book? Was she just practicing her name? Can we talk about women's literacy? These are the kinds of things that I'm so excited to learn about in the work that we do, in what we're doing for footprints. Just one example of what we did, of one of the things that we found, we worked with a list that Audrey Offenberg, the world's expert on the earliest Hebrew printed books, which are called incunabula, the books printed in the 15th century, made a list of books missing from Jewish libraries in Europe after World War II, of incunabula. So of these very first books printed in the first 50 years of printing, he knew what had been in libraries and what was now missing. So the assumption was that they had been looted. And we put all of these books in footprints as records. And what we discovered, because we also put in all of the information about the incunabula at the Jewish Theological Seminary, is that we found one copy of a book that had been listed as missing that is now at JTS. So what we try to do with footprints is bring together libraries in a way that they won't be brought together again. Jewish libraries especially, have moved so much that they're all over the place, and we're not trading books to reunite other libraries, but we can do that in the digital world. We can digitally reconstruct these libraries, and that's incredibly exciting that we can start to do this again. Am I at time? Okay. So I'll just say, do I have one more thing? Time for one more thing? Sorry. One more thing just about libraries. People bemoan the death of circulation. Books are no longer being used. And I think what we have to think about is reframing it, how books are being used. So books physical books are maybe used less because digital copies of those books are available online. Studies have shown there is certainly not a decline of reading. People are definitely still reading in many, many formats. And one of the things that I was thinking about in thinking about this was the first Hebrew Bible that was printed. The first books that were ever printed were not Bibles. They were commentaries. They were Jewish legal texts. They were grammars. The first Hebrew Bible was not printed until 1482, which is actually, a ways down the road. And it included the commentary of Rashi, because they weren't printing books that were already accessible. One could go to the synagogue and see the Torah scroll that was there. You could access, so they were trying to think about how to produce new materials that were scarcer. So that doesn't mean that the Bible was less important to the Jews of that time. It simply meant that they were able to access that in different formats, and so they were experimenting with this new technology to see, okay, well, what can we do that we don't have? How can we broaden the scope of the kinds of things that we need? So I think we need to broaden our thoughts about what a book is. Is a book the text? Is a book a physical object bound with two covers and paper in the middle? And maybe if we start to think a little bit differently about that, I think there might be a little bit less pessimism about what people are reading and that people are reading in the book at large. So I'll stop there.
So when you're in these things and you get the same questions, and not surprisingly, we share some interests, so there may be some overlap. But let me, at the risk of making this too autobiographical, I want to sort of just trace in a way how I came to think of myself as a historian of books, and why I think that matters. Maybe it only matters to me, but I think it has maybe some larger implications. So, I mean, it's fair to say I was always bookish. I was interested in history. But what drew me into the idea of getting a PhD in early modern Jewish history was an interest that began as a history of Jewish thought, of ideas, of intellectual history. And I was drawn, I didn't want to be a philosopher and I didn't want to be a theologian. I was really drawn to history because I was always interested in the ideas in their particular context. What was going on at that time in the world? Why were these ideas coming to the fore? And when I was in graduate school and I began thinking of a way to explore that, that eventually became that book that Marjorie mentioned, A Reception History of Judah Halevi's book of the Kuzari, this 12th century apologetic for Judaism. I thought I had found a really good venue for thinking about this, because what I thought I would do is I would read the book, right, and then I would read commentaries on the book written in different periods of Jewish history and in different contexts. So I would read commentaries that were written in 15th century Spain and southern France, shortly before Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492. I thought I would read commentaries, a particular commentary that was written in Renaissance Italy. I thought I would read two different commentaries that were produced by Jewish maskilim, by adherents of the Jewish Enlightenment movement in the 18th century. And then I thought I would read what were Jews in the 19th century through modernity and the emergence of new denominations. What were they thinking about this medieval book and so on? And so this is a kind of how it began. And it really, in a sense, I was a good historian, so I was always paying attention. I thought I was, anyway, paying attention to context. But I was really interested in the words on the page, the text, the ideas, and then what people were writing about this. But as I was going, I was seeing in rare book rooms, including the Jewish Theological Seminary, and rare book rooms in New York, rare book rooms in Philadelphia, rare book rooms in Israel, and I was seeing multiple copies of these books and manuscripts sometimes. I was really starting to pay attention to what I would call the materiality of the books, the texts themselves, the individual copies, and that began to influence then the way I was thinking about the intellectual history, the way that different books were being repackaged for different audiences. Not only what people were saying in the commentaries, but then how the commentaries were presented to the readers. And so I became, I think, more attuned to what was going on with the physical nature of these books, and not just the texts. And of course, if you think about it, this makes perfect sense, right? Ideas do travel. I was going to say ideas don't travel through the air. Ideas do travel through the air. It's happening right now in this room. But ideas in books don't just jump from the page into the brain of the reader. There's something in between, and that's the artifact. That's the way they're reading it, whether they're reading a manuscript, whether they're reading a printed book with commentaries on the side. Are people making their own notes in it? And one of the things that really struck me in doing this, and this was, I was really excited because I found that there were two 18th century editions of this book, the Kuzari. One was printed in Vienna, one in Berlin at the end of the 18th century, and they had lists of subscribers, people who had paid in advance to get a copy. This was the 18th century book publishing version of Kickstarter, right? In order to get the book published, you solicited the subscribers beforehand, and then they all got copies. And as I was reading the list of names, I was seeing the Jewish elite, the mercantile Jewish elite of Prague, of Vienna, of Berlin, and of Königsberg, of places all over Eastern Europe and Central Europe at the end of the 18th century. And some of them were known names. Some of them were famous as followers of the Frankist movement. And I got really interested in all of this. And I remember telling one of my professors in graduate school about this, and he turned to me and said, how do you know this wasn't, how do you know they read the book when they got the copy in the mail? Maybe, he said, this was the 18th century version of Stephen Hawking. You remember that book, Brief History of Time? How many of you own the book? How many of you, I won't ask. And then how many of you read the book? I own it, but I didn't read it. And so he asked me, was it in sponsoring publication of this book, was this an engagement with the ideas of the book, or was this a kind of symbolic way of saying we we think this is good on our cultural agenda, and we want to further this kind of scholarship, right? Or this kind of ideas. Did it become a coffee table book? Did it stay on the shelf? What were they signaling? And that question, I think, has really struck me at the time and has really stayed with me now, 20 years on, thinking about that in a way. And so that's kind of how it began. I want to say, and I'll be quick, I wasn't the only, I didn't think this up on my own material text. University of Pennsylvania was running a history of material text seminar for years and years. The history of the book as a field was really taking off in the 80s and the 90s and into the early 2000s. But it was a way in which I began to think of what I was doing with books, and maybe what one should do with books as a historian was not only being an intellectual historian, or on the other hand, a social historian trying to reconstruct what people did, but really kind of thinking about the culture of what we were seeing. And what that did was, again, it reinforced for me the importance of paying attention to the physicality of the books, right? How is it being marketed on the title page, right? Do we have an owner's signature in an individual copy? Was there a censor from the church who expurgated passages that were deemed anti-Christian? And yes, there were many books that this happened. And then what happened when they handed the book back to the Jewish owner? And we can see in many cases that the Jewish owner recopied in the margin the passage, maybe from a friend's book that hadn't been censored yet, the passage that was censored. So we have all kinds of ways that we can see, oh, the church was censoring, but what effect did that have? For other books, are there coffee, are there wine stains? I was thinking a lot about Haggadot, right? Thinking about Baruch Boxer, but I was really thinking about Haggadot. Yeah, we all see the wine stains in Haggadot. But how about other kinds of brown stains on study Bibles with commentaries? Did someone spill their coffee while they were up, or their tea late at night, poring over these passages, right? Are there pages that have not been cut, right? Old, early printed books, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, are printed, right? They're folded, they're printed, if it's quarto, like this, folded over, and then when you, the purchaser, get the book, you've got to cut the pages. You can go into rare book rooms and you can see pages that are uncut. You can see marginalia, tons of marginalia on the first few pages of a book. It peters out. They lost interest. Yes, Kindle, right? We know Amazon has a way to measure this on your Kindle. How far into the book are you reading, right? There was no early modern Amazon doing this, but we can now look at the marginalia and see this. So and I'll just end up by saying that, in many ways then, where I came as a historian and then not as a librarian, although, in a sense, the training was very similar for both of us, as we got into this, to that same point about books as artifacts. And I just want to, I think that's so important to emphasize that when we think about the Jewish past, right, if we think like archaeologists, right, the books and the manuscripts that we have from the Middle Ages and the early modern period are the most plentiful artifacts we have, physical remains of the past. We've got ritual objects, we've got some archaeological findings, right? But we have hundreds, thousands, this library, tens of thousands of artifacts, right, of the past that we can pick up and study. Early modern historians, we don't spend a lot of time on archaeological digs. Maybe we should do more. But we have these books, right, as the artifacts, and so I think that's really important. And I think that gives you an idea of the excitement of what thinking about books and then the physical nature of texts, whether it's books, whether it's scroll, whether it's screen, whether it's printed or manuscript, can do for thinking about history.
Okay, so I'll pick up. Is this on? I'll pick up just about almost exactly where Adam left off. I'll try also not to be too autobiographical. When I was in graduate school trying to come up with something to write my thesis about, I swore up and down that it wasn't going to be about books. I didn't want to be one of those people who fetishized the book. and I guess Mantracht and der Gott lacht, man has plans and God laughs, and so everything turned out just a little bit differently. I ended up writing a book about a book collector. And in many ways, in a very different way than Adam's starting point, which was about ideas, I was very little interested in the ideas that were contained within books. Instead, I wanted to explore books as things, the thinginess of books, the social and political lives that books have as they travel between people, and what we can learn when we try to unpack a library, as the great German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin once described it, what we can learn when we unpack a library and explore all of the different paths that its constituent parts took as they came together into a single collection. Because, of course, books as things are more than just bearers of ideas, as you've begun to point out to us. They also tell us about all of these contacts between people that might otherwise escape our attention. I'm sure we've all had moments where we have seen a library dissolve, or where we've watched a library go to different heirs, for example. I remember when I was in high school, my aunt's mother decided that I should be the rightful heir to her family library as the guy who seemed to like books more than anybody else in the family. And so I went there with my parents one day, and we actually printed up book stamps in advance, and we were going to mark all of the books. There already, we were going to think about how these books became a part of my collection. And as I began to take the books off of the bookshelf and pack them into boxes, my aunt's mother came along and plucked them out of the boxes and put them back on the bookcases. They were books that she was not interested in reading, as you say, and had no plans to read, but the very thinginess of them, the emotions that dwelt between her and these books was something that was far too forceful to sever in that moment. And at other moments in time in Jewish history and in the wider history, I think of human society more generally, books have, and I think continue, to occupy a privileged position of power as objects with great emotive force, objects with social lives, and also objects of power. When I was exploring the story of a 17th and 18th century chief rabbi, who I believe held one of the world's most remarkable and magnificent collection of books, it became clear to me that books in this man's hands were objects of power and influence, that books flowed into his collection as gifts from other people who sought favors that he could bestow upon them, and that the very representation of bookishness, the way that we portray our books, the way that we show our books to the world, also speaks something of that equation between knowledge and power, and that to represent authority is a way of exercising power as well. So we have intimate individual relationships with the books that we love. We have collective social ties to books, and also some of us can flex our muscles with books in ways that others of us cannot or do not. And books have these multi-layered stories that offer us a vantage point, a window into worlds that might otherwise escape our attention. And this is certainly the case if we think about books in concert, in dialogue with other sorts of documents from the past. If we use the hidden archive of books, the inscriptions within them, to get at the stories of little people who were wrapped up in greater affairs. Or, in a different way, if we think about relationships, Jews' relationships to books as they paralleled that of their non-Jewish neighbors. Sometimes these offer us evidence of modes of being that we might not otherwise see if we only looked, let's say, at elite rabbinic texts, for example. Now, of course, there are multiple ways to get at these stories. I don't claim that this is the only way to get at those tales. But a history of things sometimes allows us to democratize tales of the past, to broaden the history that we tell, and to engage new stories that might otherwise have escaped our attention.
Okay, thank you. So the invention of the printing press in the 15th century is often hailed as a media revolution, the likes of which have been repeated with the introduction of new media formats across time, the invention of the radio, television, the rise of the internet. It's easy to think that when new technologies come, the ebook, internet, that everything changes. but the history of books tell us that new technologies usually do not replace old technologies, but change the way they're used. Print did not kill manuscripts. The e-reader and the internet have not ended the use of printed books. Reflecting on your own area of expertise, can you describe specific moments in which the invention of print generated change? Can you point to instances where media revolution did not change the book at all? Are there other technological, social, political types of change we should be thinking about? I open it up. Adam, maybe you want to
Oh, we
start.
decided we're going to
We're
switch.
going to
Oh,
switch
right, okay.
orders.
All right, so there are so many examples, and I will try to be quick. And so here are two quick things. I became very interested in a book called Bechinat Olam. It's a medieval Spanish medieval book written by a Spanish Provençal Jew. It's in Hebrew. It's the title Bechinat Olam means examination of the world. The thing about this book is it's relatively short. It consists of some poetic language about the world and that God created and God's role in the world. And third, it's a book that most contemporary Jews, even well-educated ones, have never heard of. And I won't ask who's heard of it and who hasn't. But if you look at the number of manuscripts from the late Middle Ages that are still extant, and you look at the number of printed editions of this book, this was basically a pre-modern Jewish bestseller. And when you explore the history of this book, you find there are two things that one finds. On the one hand, print matters a lot. The business model of print. When print comes along, you're not commissioning someone to write out a book for you or writing out a book for yourself. It becomes a commercial enterprise, and paper is expensive up front. Early on, you've got to commission a goldsmith to make the typefaces for you. You've got a capital investment. You've got to make sure you're going to make this investment back, right? And so this brings in something, which is you need to hope that if you're going to print 300 copies, 500 copies, and put in all that labor, and with it you're going to get that back. You're not going to go broke. A lot of early modern printers completely misjudged the market and went broke. This happened again and again. But what that means is you've got to think about who your audience is going to be if you're printing a book. And so this introduces things like marketing, like title pages, like introductions, which are kind of didn't have the back of the book. Instead, they would have an introduction that says, "Dear reader, this is why you should be buying this book." And the great thing here for these printers is the author was literally dead. This was not a theoretical idea of English professors. The author was dead and had been for quite a long time. And so different printers thought of different ways to make the book, to sell the book. So we have some editions of this book from the 16th century that are small, octavo. They could fit in your pocket. They might have the nikud, suggesting that it's poetry to be read out loud. You could carry it with you and meditate on God's role in the world. Or it's printed in quarto, the main format of books that a scholarly book would be in. It has commentaries down the side of the page. It has a learned introduction. And so it's being sold then as a serious philosophical treatise, right, for the learned, for the elite. And so it's the same basic text, but the printers are doing all kinds of different things with it, so we get the freedom. And the new technology is what's driving this variety of different editions. On the other hand, when you look at some of the commentaries that are printed, already existed in manuscript. Some of the descriptions of the author, well, they weren't on a title page, but they were at the very beginning of the text copied out by scribes in the Middle Ages, or at the end of the book saying, this book was by so-and-so and so-and-so. So on the one hand, the technology drives a lot of change, a lot of flexibility, a lot of different marketing. And on the other hand, what's the easiest thing for these printers to do? It's to pick up what they already had in manuscript and have a kind of a sense of continuity. And I want to throw in one other great example, which is a place where print failed. So we all know about you know them, right? They're people who work in the tech industry. They were the first to have an iPhone, right? So there were these two printers in the middle of the 16th century. One was a physician, one was a rabbi, Marjorie and Ottolenghi. They printed in a small place in northern Italy called Riva del Garda, and they had a little printing business going on. And they thought, you know what? Esther scrolls. Purim's coming. Everybody's going to want a Esther scroll. Let's print it. And we know we can't print the Sefer Torah. We know we can't print the scroll of the Torah. That's not going to go. But who says you can't print the Esther scrolls? So they print up some Esther scrolls and they try and sell them. Just in time for Purim. They get, what's a nice way to put it? They get slammed by their fellow rabbis of northern Italy because because ever since the transition from scroll to codex to book format, right? Jews said, sure, we'll embrace the new technology for study and reading, but for ritual in the synagogue, we want to keep reading from the Sefer Torah. We're going to keep reading the scroll of Esther. We're going to unroll or unfold, actually, in some, right, depending on the tradition, unroll or unfold the scroll of Esther, right? And we want that it's ritual, so we want that to be hand copied, right? We don't want to be reading from a printed one. And I have to actually pay credit where credit is due. I learned about that from an article that was co-authored by the late Vivian Mann, who was on the faculty here at JTS and was the director of the Jewish Museum, who wrote an article about this because it generates a lot of controversy over, and they thought they had a great idea, right? Everybody can have a copy, we'll sell, we'll make money. It didn't go because the community of Jews in northern Italy said, at least their rabbis said, no, let's if it's for ritual purposes, let's keep it in manuscript. Let's not turn this into a printed book. And I think that's a very telling example about the enthusiasm for the new technology and then a kind of no, it's not clear that there's a halachic prohibition. Some rabbis said there were, others rabbis said there weren't, but it was a sensibility about how you should continue to keep up the old format.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just a couple of quick points. First, just a quick, on that perfect note of ending on the scroll, on the contrary, there are manuscripts that are in the collection that I curate that are written in scroll form, rather not sacred texts. But the point of these manuscripts, one of them is a history of the black and white Jews of Malabar and Cochin in India. And the idea was that this is an ancient story. We're talking about this ancient community, and it's written in a scroll, and it's on a roll. We have a Megillat Saragossa of the miracle that happened in either Saragossa or Syracuse, depending on who you are, what you say. But also, like histories of communities, deep histories that were deeply ingrained in a community or very important to a community. We have a scroll of Yom Tov Lipmanhaller's Megillat Eva. So his story of what happened to him when he was arrested. He had a lot of stuff go on with him, and that's written in a scroll, because again, this was considered almost sacred. It's so important at a personal level, at a communal level, that we're not going to print it. And some of these things were actually printed, but they also, in the early modern period, definitely after print was well established, it was important to keep some of these things in manuscript to say this has an extra level of sacredity, just like the sacred texts and the Bible. I just wanted to point to a couple of parallels that I see sometimes in thinking about new and old technologies, as far as generating change. So there's a New Yorker cartoon that I love, which shows two elderly men sitting in a library, and one turns to the other and says, those who know history are doomed to stand by and watch while others repeat it. And one of the things that I think about in working with both old and new collections in the library is, what are the parallels? Where do we see the same thing happening again and again? So there are some positive ones. It's not all gloom and doom. But So for instance, science and medicine, with the approach of printing, there are anatomy books, there are astronomy books, there are all sorts of books that detail in great detail the human body, the inside of the human body, the stars, all sorts of things, where science and mathematics and all sorts of things in those areas were then printed and could be accessible and available. I'll get to the downside of that in a minute, but one of the things that we have at Columbia is in the libraries actually, is a 3D printer. And we had a physician from the medical school who was going to be doing a surgery for the first time on an infant's heart. And he asked that the librarian who works with the 3D printer print a full-size replica of the infant heart. And he said that he kept it in his pocket for months before he did this surgery. And the idea was when the time came to deal with the actual heart, he was so intimately aware of the makeup of it because he had spent all of that time with it. So, technologies change, and we learn things from different aspects in technology, but I think it's important that the 3D printer is in the library because this is something that we see as part of scholarship. Building new things comes with scholarship, and that's something that our library supports. On the flip side, and this comes with medicine, because the way that they got images of bodies was sometimes by digging them up, is fear of too much information. So I think we can very much relate to that in this very, some people would say TMI, too much information, digital age, where we're thinking about regulating should the internet be regulated, should Facebook be tapping down on political ads the way that Twitter did, should all these sorts of questions, who's in charge of the internet, who has control over it. If you think about it, it took 100 years for the Catholic Church to print their first index of printed books. So a lot happened in the 100 or so years, before the first index of prohibited books was put out by the Catholic Church. So stuff started to be printed. And you have, even with Jewish books, there was a book that was printed in Mantua in the 1470s, that the author of the book ended up being actually kicked out of his town, partially because of a dispute he got into with another person. There were other things involved. But the book that he printed was considered heretical by the rabbis. It was problematic. But people were like, wait, what is this thing that suddenly people can access all this information, dangerous information? And how do we get a handle on it? And how do we control it? And from the very first index in 1559, one of the books that was consistently in it was the Talmud and all of its commentaries. And you find that even before the index was printed, of course, the Talmud was burnt in Rome just a few years earlier. So the idea, I think there are a lot of parallels between where we think of the first books being printed and how long it took them to get a handle on what could be dangerous. And we think of dangerous in different ways. Obviously, the Catholic Church has different ideas of what's dangerous than other institutions. But this is something that takes time to grapple with. And I think thinking about what happened earlier when looking at modern technologies and the fears we might have about modern technologies, there are certainly parallels that we can think about there.
So as I'm thinking about this question, I'm very struck by part of the framing that we put together for this, and I promise this was not planned before, I really just thought of this now. It occurs to me that even the very word revolution, of course, captures a kind of paradoxical meaning to it. Something revolutionary is fresh and new and is out with the old, but earlier meanings of the word revolution itself, like the revolution of the planets, for example, captures a kind of cyclical motion, a return. So that the very word revolution captures the idea of novelty and a casting off of that which came before, and at the same time envisions a kind of return. And I'm very struck by the return of the repressed when it comes to media revolutions. there's that famous song, "Video Killed the Radio Star," and it wouldn't have been inconceivable to imagine that radio would be entirely dead, or that the world of auditory information would be something long in the past. But if I'm understanding from my friends who know how to use their phones better than I do, the renaissance of radio dwells in the podcast in ways that certainly could not have been imagined before. When people were afraid that television would be the death of reading, we read in unimagined levels. Just the very fact that we are constantly communicating textually, or perhaps I should say people who are my students who are late teenagers communicate almost exclusively textually. I asked them last semester who they call on the phone. And they gave me these like blank stares. And they said the only people we speak to on the phone are our parents, and that's it. And through everybody else that they communicate with, and they communicate more than ever. The volume of communication put out by people my students' age are all through textual communication. In some ways, they have returned to a kind of epistolarity, to a letter writing culture. With very different conventions. There are no salutations at the beginning, nor greetings at the end, or anything like that. KK thanks is, I think, the most common one that gets sent, and I feel it in the emails they send me as well that often say, "Hey, prof, when's the assignment due? KK thanks." But still, we are watching these kind of this coexistence of different forms of media, of the visual, of the auditory, of the textual, that exist and have exist through every kind of media revolution. I always get a little bit competitive when I'm sitting next to Adam on stage, and so when he talks about a bestseller, it makes me want to think about a bestseller as well. And so I'll raise what I think was a far, far better or far bigger bestseller of the early modern period. And I'll defer in part to conversations I've had with my teachers and mentors who are here in the room, with Ted Fram and with Sharon Mintz. I think that books preparing people to learn how to do shrita, how to slaughter animals for kosher meat production, are the true bestsellers of the early modern period. They were printed on average every 2 years or so. A brand new edition of this kind of book emerged between about the year 1530 and the year 1800. They ran off the presses. And they offered different justifications, or their producers offered different justifications for them. There are some that carry endorsements by rabbis that say, "Thank goodness this book has been produced. Now all of the unlearned, uneducated, ignorant butchers will finally be able to get it right." I don't know if they were expecting the butchers not to have read those pages in it, or perhaps they didn't even care about the insults explicitly enshrined there. Sometimes they were produced in Yiddish, and perhaps speaking about vernacular or different language production that the age of print enables in new ways as marketers look for new audiences to peddle their wares to. In an age of print capitalism, helps us to see different things there as well. But in so many of these documents, or in so many of these books, as my teachers have taught me, we often see the relics of all kinds of manuscript and oral cultures that coexist uncomfortably in the pages as well. We'll see the inscription of a teacher who says, "I tested the shoichet and found his work that he performed in front of me face to face to be acceptable, and therefore I sign in manuscript form into this printed book that this person is now certified to do the job." And so we see three different kinds of media, three different kinds of relations braided into a single artifact. The oral, the directly unmediated, the textual, the perhaps least personal, and then the handwritten that pulls the two of them into a single frame. And so as we think about different forms of media revolution, I get so excited about thinking about the ways that the revolution captures both the very, very new and the durability, perhaps even the increased or heightened insertion of the old into, as it inscribes itself, into new forms of media.
So, I mean, given the time we do have, I have one more question that I want to pose to all of you. which I'm hoping you'll really take a very brief answer, briefly answer, because I want to kind of open up to some of the questions coming from the audience, and so we can start a little bit of a discussion. But I just was hoping that you could comment on how the attention to the history of book history and change, or actually, let me rephrase that. How does the attention to the history of the book change the way we think about Judaism, about Jewish history, about Jewish culture? Have we learned anything from past history, from the scroll to the codex, the manuscript to print, that can help us to understand something about today, our present, or even predict the future of books? So if some of you, maybe not all of you, but I think Josh, you'd be first on this one.
Maybe we'll start collecting the index cards while we answer these questions.
Okay, yeah, so if you have index cards to turn in, that would be great, and
Right
wanna...
neatly, we've been doing paleography work all day, so we don't want to have to do it tonight.
So
go
Marjorie and Rachel, I'm sorry, Susan and Rachel. Susan, by the way, is our wonderful lead developer on Footprints, so she's,
Okay, so go
we'll
ahead.
be collecting the cards, so they'll walk around.
Okay, so go ahead.
So
Do that.
I want to, if I'm allowed to say it in the JTS synagogue, I want to be evangelical about this for a minute, and really sort of say, I want to spread the good. I feel like in part, what I like to do is sort of spread the good news about this. And that is this, and it's appropriate that we're sitting in the synagogue. Just think for a minute about the Siddur, or even more, perhaps think about the High Holiday Machzor, and what it means to start to study the history of Jewish liturgical books, and what that might. I'm not going to tell you or say what that would do for your understanding of what you should be doing if you are Jewish and if you are someone who goes and prays in the synagogue, or what the agenda should be at your synagogue's next ritual committee meeting or liturgy meeting. But one of the things we're used to thinking about change in the Siddur or the Machzor or the High Holiday Prayer Book as something about modernity. It's something about the different denominations. It's something about the different movements. And it's also about wanting to change things and make things more modern. And we can have there's a fabulously rich history of liturgy. But when we think about something as simple as the Machzor, and we think about the High Holiday Prayer Book, and we think about, and maybe you think about this when you go to synagogue on the high holidays, if you go to synagogue on the high holidays, why is the service, the Ashkenazic service, in an Orthodox or a traditional or a conservative, even in some reconstructions, reforms, why is it so long? Why is this service so long? Perhaps you've thought of that. And I think you can just think of it as I don't know, the rabbinic filibuster or something, but in fact there are some elements of the early modern history of the first printed Machzors that can help us think about what was happening. And the really quick, brief version, which I'm massively oversimplifying, a huge body of scholarship, goes something like this. Let's say you're a printer in the Ashkenazic sphere, and you want to put out a Machzor. As I said, remember I said before, you've got to sell hundreds of copies of this, right? If you only do the liturgy of the Jews of Cologne, or the Jews of Worms, or the Jews of the what was used to be called Austria, or still called Austria, but it's not exactly the same as the modern nation state, you'd go broke. You'd go broke, because they have, over there in Cologne, there's one particular piyut, liturgical poem, that they like to say before the Torah reading on Yom Kippur morning. And over in Mainz, they have another one they like to say. And up in Speyer, they have another one, right? And in the new Jewish communities in Poland, there's another one. And down in Austria, there's another one. If you'd go broke if you tried to print one for Mainz, one for Cologne, one for Worms, one for Poland, one for Krakow, one for Prague, the safest thing to do is put, and you wouldn't sell in Krakow if you didn't put the piyut that they like to use there, right? So the safest thing to do is put in all 5 or 6 or 7 piyutim. And that's how you sell your copies. And early on, again, I'm oversimplifying, for heuristic purposes. Early on, the local tradition is preserved, but as Jews move around, as Jews migrate, as new traditions come to the fore, this specificity is lost, and you begin to get to a point in which you are saying all of them, right? And so, again, I'm not telling you what to do in your next ritual committee meeting to plan the next high holidays if you happen to be an active synagogue member. But if you study this history and you think about the role of the new technology, and even something as prosaic as the business model, right, of the printers, it can give you a whole different appreciation for something that maybe often we just take for granted. We might complain about it. We might love it. Some people love Pew Team, and they complain if the service they go to leaves one out, right? So, it can go either direction, I know. But we can understand something different if we start paying attention to the history of how that thing that we might just be taking for granted came into our hands in the modern period. And I think the roots of it go back. So that's just a quick example.
Did you want to comment, or should we take some of these questions?
I'll maybe just throw one little thing into the hopper. Prayer books and the space of the synagogue is one way to look at the use of books. I would be curious also if we would extend the question, let's say, to Jewish religious life, not necessarily particular kinds of observances, but wider forms of Jewish religious life at home. So, for example, the production of instruction books for customs to be observed at home, or I don't know, what do, let's say, popular cookbooks do to creating a kind of standard set of menus that one can find in a multiplicity of homes in a particular location? How do recipes and recipe books become popular but also kind of shape certain tastes? And what's the relationship between the printed book and the food that makes it to the table? Of course, the relationship is a complicated one. Sometimes recipes and traditions are passed down through time, but also the popularity of kosher by design, short on time, for example, projects particular dishes into kitchens across at least New Jersey, if I'm understanding correctly. But far beyond that as well, that kind of craft a different kind of palate. And perhaps I won't say too much more about that, but I think just to sort of throw that out there into thinking about the way even forms of sensory experience can be changed by the standardizing practices of the book.
Okay, so we're going to just turn to some of these great questions.
We're going to pluck them
All right, so here, you want to pluck them out of a hat?
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just begin. So does reading an email about Daf Yomi per day, or does reading an email about it per day count as doing Daf Yomi? So if, like, you're reading an email, does it count, or do you want to?
Who's the judge? I mean, who gets to decide? That's who rules on your study? This is not actually a halachic thing. This is something that people choose to do, and they can do it, I think, in whatever way they want. I've seen so many different ways of engaging with Daf Yomi. Again, like you said, after, there's Tweet the Daf. There's somebody who illustrates the contents of the page of Daf Yomi every day. And it's a beautiful illustration, and it's a summary. It is a summary. And let me tell you, if you look at that picture, do you get the full immersive experience of studying Talmud? I don't know, but who am I to judge?
I would say, of course it does. Because basically, you're engaging with it. Here's another that I'm going to...
Can I just... Yeah, I want to get...
We want to talk about Daf Yomi also. We all want to talk about Daf Yomi.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, all I was going to say about that is the attachment to the daf is, of course, itself kind of forgetting that was not always... Talmuds were not given at Sinai in the shape of the daf as we know it today. So it's interesting that the 20th century innovation of the Daf Yomi that attached itself to the 19th century publication of the Vilna Shas has captured the imagination as the way that counts to do it, so that the very fact that the question needs to be asked points to the amazing power of technology and cultural innovation together that decide, so that even if you need to ask the question, can I be forgiven for doing this in a different way, demonstrates the great imaginative power that the structure of the page, which is not how the page of this particular text always was, has captured the imagination as the right way to do something.
And that's
the
because
snowball
of print.
works.
That's because of print. I mean, the reasons for why we have a page number to each page of Talmud is because of print.
Right.
That's what print gave us, but so I think that's an important contribution.
Can I say
but
something about
yes.
that? So, I mean, the Daf Yomi thing I think is fascinating. I mean, really interesting, and I think it's just a great case study of what's going on. And so I think there's a kind of cyclical thing going on in which every 7 years now, more and more people at the end of the cycle, this phenomenon gets more publicity, and then more and more people learn about it, and then they want to join in. Josh said to me the other day, he thinks it's...
I'll push back to
Yeah.
this and say, I don't know if at the end of every cycle more people get into it. I think at the beginning of each cycle, people get excited about it for a short amount of time.
And it's like
I
they're-
know that gym membership
Right.
spurs, for example, like spikes on the 1st of January, but by the 30th of January,
Right.
people are already letting their membership lapse.
But as I said, so there's something about technology though that's important, right? I mean, people are reading it on their phones while they walk their dog, as Marjorie said on Safari. I look at Safari on my iPad. My phone's too small. While I drink my coffee in the morning after I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then I go to Safari and I look at and I go look at the Daf Yomi. And it's funny, right? Because to me, it feels like in some ways this is a very inauthentic form of Talmud study. I'm not engaged with the Shakla V'Tarya. I don't have a Chavruta, right? I'm not doing Talmud study the way I was first told this is what Talmud study is supposed to look like, right? I'm not looking at a Sorat Hadaf, the mise en page of the Bomberg through the Vilna Shas edition of a Talmud, right? On the other hand, I feel like this becomes part of the routine and the ritual of one's day, and it's a different relationship, and it can't help. And this is something that the four of us have talked about this a lot. We really find this fascinating as a group, but it really makes me think about the 16th century, right? And there's wonderful scholarship in part by someone who was one of my teachers in Israel named Elchanan Reiner, but there's wonderful scholarship on what happens and Ted Fram has contributed to this, who's here. What happens in the rabbinic world when print comes along and people start printing codes of Jewish law or these minhagim books,
Even before,
or other things, right? And there
burning
were
the
codes, but they didn't have the same sense of widespread diffusion. And you have rabbis who say, "This is it. They're going to
It's
put
over.
It's
My
over.
life's over."
They're going to put us out of business." Right? Now there's a simple version out there, and everyone can buy it. Well, it didn't put them out of business, right? It opened up a different avenue, and then of course there were commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch that led to further study and so on, and so the cycle never ended. But I find the sort of particularly the issue of something like Safari, which if you don't know about Safari, right, it's an app you can have on your iPad, your iPhone, or on your smartphone, or on the internet, right, which has a massive number of Jewish texts in Hebrew. A massive number of them are translated into English. It's very easy to use. I'm not trying to, promote it, right? Sign up now. But it's a totally new way of relating to this text. But it doesn't mean that all the old forms just disappear. They continue as well. So I think it's a great case study of what's going on.
And it enhances too, because basically on the one hand, then what happens to the expert? Because you have all these people who are reading Talmud in English. On the other hand, I'm getting multiple emails every day from people I never thought I would get emails from, asking me questions about what I think about this sugya, what do I think about this text. And so it creates an engagement that just never existed before. So we're actually raising the level in some ways.
I want to just answer this question because it's very relevant to our discussion of the Talmud, which is, were there Christian printers creating or publishing Jewish books? And Daniel Bomberg, who printed the first complete edition, he wasn't the first printer of the Talmud, but he printed the first complete edition of the Talmud, basically set the standard of what the Talmud looks like today. And many, many aspects of the Talmud that you look at today were created by this Christian printer who got the privilege to print the Talmud in Venice. But there were plenty of Christians that printed Jewish texts for various reasons. Sometimes they were internal Christian interests. There was a form of study. There was something that we call Christian Hebraism, which were Christians who studied Hebrew to get to know their religion better, and sometimes to try to convince Jews that really Christianity was true. But also you do have Christians that are printing for a Jewish audience as well. So that definitely existed, and I think the Talmud is the most famous example of that.
Oh, Bomberg also created the
Rabbinic Bible.
The Rabbinic Bible, which
Yes.
which evolved into the massive idea of the Mikrot Gedolot, these study Bibles with tons and tons and tons of commentaries. Also an innovation of a Christian printer, and one of the most sort of fascinating things is the first edition of Bomberg's Rabbinic Bible. He printed some copies with a dedication in the front to the Pope, and some copies without that dedication to the Pope. And it was very clear he was thinking about the market. He was thinking about the Jewish market that probably didn't really care for a dedication to the Pope, and the Christian market that did. But I can't point to any specific examples, but we have other cases where printers tried this. It's kind of dual marketing, and they weren't always completely consistent in this. So we do sometimes find if you want to call it the Jewish version with evidence of Christian ownership later. And I think, although if you ask me to quote you on this, I'm not sure, but my impression is that we also have examples of Jewish ownership of what would have been we might have thought of as the Christian version that the printers were.
We actually have
preparing.
a Christian printed book with a dedication in the back that was owned by a Jew, and the Jew crossed out the Christian dedication, and that's in Footprints. It's a book that's based at the University of Vienna.
Is that the Ferrara Bible?
No, it's not
Okay.
the Ferrara Bible, but it has this whole inscription at the end for Jesus that the clearly Jewish owner crosses out because they wanted the Hebrew text of the book, but they didn't want the Christian association with it.
So as a final question, I'm just going to throw out this one that came from you. So what are you most excited about in the future of Jewish studies using new technology?
Besides Footprints?
Footprints.
We think footprints, but in addition to footprints. I do think it's partially it's the scholarly opportunities that are going to be created for us by the use of footprints. That's what we're most excited about, that in fact we'll have this resource that's incredible, that we'll be able to promote research that we never would have thought imaginable before. But I don't know if you want to.
So there's a field of study that some might call digital humanities. It's now shifting sort of to digital scholarship because it's not only in the humanities, it's in the social sciences, it's everywhere. And this is something I care very much about, partially because of Footprints. But I think thinking about new ways to engage with ideas that we never would have thought of. 10 years ago, when people talked about digital technologies, they meant things like a digital copy of a physical image. So if you're doing digital work, it means that you're basically taking pictures and putting them on the internet of the exact same thing. Like you have a book, and then you take pictures, and you put that book online. But something like, and we mentioned Safari already, Safari, what's so amazing about them is that they completely reimagined the book in the digital age. This is not a Kindle. This is not, which I have a Kindle, but this is not a digital facsimile of a physical object, which is what many people mean when they talk about digital stuff, digitized. They really mean digitized materials. This is saying, okay, we have this technology. What do we do now? So what Sefaria did was they said, okay, everything can be hyperlinked. The world can be hyperlinked. So we have, and this is actually, when you look at the very first printers of Hebrew books, they were so excited about this. You have colophon, so at the very end of the book, they would write, the printer would write, here is this wonderful thing that we've created, where in the past we used to have multiple manuscripts to study one topic, because you had to have, if it was Bible, you needed your Bible, you needed 1 commentary, 2 commentary, 3 commentaries. If it was Talmud, you needed the same thing. Or you needed, if it was Talmud, you also needed your Bible because you needed to reference that quotation. And whereas here, click, 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 it opens all, you have all of the pages in front of you. And I think those kinds of engagements with text, reimagining the text, one of the things that we're constantly asked about for Footprints is, oh, are you guys a digitization project? Do you have all the books online? And the idea is, no, that's not the point. The point is that we're doing something that could not be done in the physical world. We could have printed a multi-volume bibliography of where books had been and how they traveled. But it's so much easier to say, oh, well, the Library of Yaakov Emden ended up in 2 places, the British Library and Columbia University. And so if we search in Footprints for Emden, we'll be able to pull up all of his library, in theory, if we had all of the information in there. And that's a new kind of thinking. And that, I think, at least for me, is what's so exciting, when we're able to look at something that we would have never thought we could do before, and now we can because of the promise and I guess the results of the digital in a lot of ways.
If I had to say what I'm most excited for, it's sort of an excitement that is based on terror and anticipates a kind of hope. The thing that I'm most excited for is for when we learn how to critically use this information overload. I think that we live in, I mean, it's already been mentioned before, we live in an era where we're just inundated by information. You won't be able to walk to the subway without getting the news broadcast at you from things that used to be phone booths, but that are now just like radiating beacons of information. We are inundated with information. And certainly this is a feeling that people before our time have felt as well. As Michelle gestured towards, when the printing press first started to generate information, people felt that they were truly just overwhelmed by the amount of data. And it produced all kinds of crises of knowledge. Who can you trust? Who are the authoritative sources and who are the charlatans? Where is the real news and where is the fake news? And so what I'm really looking forward to is when the dust settles. And I have a measure of optimism towards it because it worked in the 16th century that the dust settled, I think. And I think with each media revolution comes a kind of epistemological crisis, a fear that we're not going to be able to sort out the wheat from the chaff. I'm looking forward to when we learn how to read critically and when the dust settles so that we can use the media revolution to its fullest and be able to identify what is good and useful and what is not.
So, that's interesting. I think I might be somewhat more pessimistic about the broader media landscape than Josh. But in terms of, I heard the question as being what we might be excited about in terms of the scholarly world, what advances we'll have. And I think here, I guess here I'm more optimistic so long as there still is a scholarly world to keep doing this. Which is, I think that and particularly for Jewish texts, for Hebrew texts, for texts in other languages like Yiddish or Ladino that are in Hebrew characters, I think we're actually just at the beginning of something that, say, people who are doing English literature were already at maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And it may seem like a very narrow technical point, but something called OCR, optical character recognition, that many of you are familiar with, it was first worked on for Roman Latin characters, where you would scan the book but not just put up the image, right, but then also transcribe it, and then this made searching possible. It made what a scholar named Franco Moretti called distant reading possible, right? Nobody could ever read all of the detective novels printed in the 19th century. I would actually kind of like to personally, but you can't do it. But if you had all of them transcribed, you could search for common themes across them. And I think a lot of us have thought that would be really exciting if we could do that with pre-modern Jewish texts to sort of drill down what themes are happening. And if you use that in conjunction with something like footprints, not only can you see where the themes are, you can also see in what parts of the Jewish world people actually are paying attention to different themes. But the OCR, this again may seem like a very minor technical thing, but the OCR for Hebrew alphabets, also by the way for Arabic and all of the languages that are written in Arabic characters, Persian and so on as you go into Central Asia, it was behind. And we're just, I think we are, like, there's a group at the University of Haifa now that just announced it last week that they're very close to sort of a big breakthrough. They want to call it, I think they're calling their project Kraken, which, because I saw the Lego movie with my kids, seems kind of off. So I think we're getting close to this. And again, it may seem very narrow and technical, but I think it's going to actually open up some really exciting new ways to pull together different kinds of kind of really like big data and bring it into the study of the Jewish past. And I'm excited because I don't actually think we even really, we're just starting to think of what questions to ask about that big data. And so that's exciting. So I'll end on that optimistic
I
note.
think also in a way, it's been just really quick that I want to just say the way that all of this digital world has opened things so much, has opened knowledge so much. We talk about open source and open access, and one of the things, footprints, our data is published as soon as it's on. You press the little check mark to put your stuff in, and it's live. You know, there's something terrifying about that. Scholars spend years working on their documents and then send it to multiple editors before they send it to a publisher who has more editors. And we're thinking now more about, let's just put it out there and see what happens. And I think I just wanted to also mention the Zooniverse project, the Scribes of the Cairo Geniza, which is doing that, which is taking people who don't read medieval Judeo-Arabic, but can decipher some Hebrew letters. And they're basically transcribing the huge, gigantic corpus of the Cairo Geniza. And these are average, everyday people who are just reading, and they have ways to verify, and it has to be multiple verifications and everything else. But I think the way that it's opening is a little scary, but also kind of amazing.
So I want to just conclude by saying one of the greatest challenges that I think we have here at JTS, and we're all teachers, and we're all in the classroom. And so these new technological changes are forcing us to really rethink our pedagogy, especially in Talmud. So I think that's exciting because you don't want to stay in the same place, and you don't want to believe that you can always do the same thing over and over again, but you want to keep rethinking. And as our library was closing down and to prepare for its renovation, I was able to teach a class on the history of the Jewish book in the library, thanks to David Kramer and the help at JTS, and the students who were undergraduates had to think about the media revolution of today, and they had to produce projects that integrated their majors with the use of the kinds of technology that was available and produce new types of books. And it was incredible, the creativity and what they were able to come up with. So there's a great future. It's just a question of how we're going to do it. But if we don't think about it, and I think we are thinking about it here in a big way, then it's not going to be, then it is terrifying. But anyway, so thank you for your patience and for your questions, and we're around if you have other questions you want to ask us. Anyway, so good night.